By the summer of 1943, Germany's submarine commanders had developed something they hadn't experienced in months. It looked a lot like confidence. The North Atlantic had become a killing ground for both sides by then, but the Indian Ocean was different. It was enormous, lightly patrolled, and full of merchant ships traveling alone without escorts. Allied air coverage barely reached the middle of it. There were no hunter-killer groups, no escort carriers, no coordinated convoy networks. A submarine could surface in daylight, run on its diesel engines for hours, and see nothing but empty water. 6 German submarines spent the summer of 1943 in those waters and collectively claimed 36 ships sunk. Their commanders sent back reports that read like success stories from 2 years earlier, when the Atlantic had been open and the odds were theirs. They were right about what the Indian Ocean was. They were wrong about how long it could stay that way. By early 1944, Allied intelligence had worked out how to use the ocean's greatest weakness against the submarines that depended on it. That weakness was simple. The Indian Ocean was too far from Germany to cross without help. The moment Allied codebreakers learned how that help was organized, the escape routes started closing. One by one, they closed, and the boats that couldn't get home stayed there. The logic behind sending submarines to the Indian Ocean in late 1942 was straightforward. The Atlantic was getting harder to work. Allied aircraft coverage had expanded. Convoy escort groups had gotten better. Germany was losing submarines faster than it was building them. Admiral Dönitz needed somewhere to send his longer-range boats where they could still produce results. The Indian Ocean was everything the Atlantic wasn't. Allied convoy organization there was loose by North Atlantic standards. Merchant ships regularly sailed alone between ports in South Africa, East Africa, India, and the Persian Gulf. Ideal solo targets with no escort and no coordinated routing system to protect them. Coastal air patrols concentrated near the major ports and couldn't reach open ocean. A submarine that stayed away from the coast could operate with a freedom that had become impossible in the Atlantic by 1943. The Type 9D2 made this possible. It was the largest standard combat submarine Germany produced, almost 90 meters long, over 1,600 tons submerged, with a surface range of 32,000 nautical miles at 10 knots. Boats like Wolfgang Luth's U-181 and Werner Hartmann's U-198 could leave Europe, round the Cape of Good Hope, and still have fuel and provisions to patrol the Indian Ocean for months. These weren't typical submarines pressed into unusual service. They were built for exactly this kind of mission. The first German submarine rounded the Cape in October 1942. It was the beginning of a phase that would last about a year before everything started to go wrong. The voyage to the Indian Ocean was itself a serious undertaking. A submarine leaving from Bordeaux or Kiel had to navigate the Bay of Biscay under Royal Air Force aircraft, get south through the Atlantic without being spotted, round the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, and then transit north through unfamiliar waters. The entire journey took roughly 2 months of careful navigation, rationed fuel, and constant attention to the weather. Submarines that made it were running on reduced food by the time they arrived. The provisions for the outward voyage consumed more than the planners had anticipated on some early patrols. But making it there meant entering a different war. The Indian Ocean in 1942 and early 1943 was, from the German perspective, genuinely inviting. Allied convoy routing had not yet adapted to the submarine threat there. Single ships crossing large stretches of ocean were common. There were no organized groups hunting submarines as there were in the North Atlantic. A crew that had survived the brutal mathematics of the Atlantic, where the odds of completing a patrol were getting worse every month, found themselves in waters where those odds seemed manageable again. That contrast is what made the Indian Ocean so compelling as a strategic option, and so dangerous as a temptation. It offered success that felt like the early Atlantic, without the underlying problem that had made the Atlantic fatal: the Allies' capacity to concentrate overwhelming resources at any point they chose, as soon as they chose to. Wolfgang Luth left Kiel in September 1942 with U-181 and spent the next 4 months in the waters between Cape Town and Madagascar. He sank 12 ships. On November 13th, still at sea, he received a radio signal announcing he'd been awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross. 2 days later, a British destroyer found him. The engagement lasted 9 hours. Luth went deep, took the damage, and eventually escaped. He repaired the boat at sea and went back to work. By the time U-181 reached Bordeaux in January 1943, Luth had sunk 12 ships for nearly 60,000 tons. Germany awarded him the Diamonds, the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds, the highest combat decoration in the German armed forces. Fewer than 30 men in all of Germany's military ever received it. Luth was the first submariner. He went back out in March 1943. That second patrol lasted 205 days, the second longest combat patrol of the entire war. While still at sea in August 1943, he received another radio signal. The Diamonds were confirmed. He was somewhere between Madagascar and Mauritius on a boat that had been at sea for over 5 months when the news arrived. It wasn't just Luth. In the summer of 1943, 7 Type 9D boats operated simultaneously in the Indian Ocean. Luth's U-181, Hartmann in U-198, Robert Geise in U-177, Wilhelm Dommes in U-178, Eitel Friedrich Kentrat in U-196, Robert Bartels in U-197, and Heinz Buchholz in U-195. They operated across an area spanning from Durban north through the Mozambique Channel and east past Madagascar. Together, they claimed 36 ships sunk, totaling roughly 235,000 tons. According to the Hyperwar Ultra documents, these figures are from the commander's own reported claims, and actual sinkings may differ slightly. But even accounting for overclaiming, the scale was significant. In a single summer, in an ocean that was supposed to be a backwater of the war. On June 22, 1943, the boats rendezvoused with the supply ship Charlotte Schliemann, south of Madagascar, for refueling. The first refueling operation of its kind in the Indian Ocean. The commanders gathered on the surface of the ocean. They exchanged patrol reports. They discussed torpedo failures. They talked about the shipping patterns they'd observed. Think about what that refueling rendezvous represented. 6 submarine commanders, whose counterparts in the North Atlantic were dying at a rate of more than 40 boats a month, surfacing in calm water on a sunny day in the Indian Ocean to meet a tanker and swap stories. The Charlotte Schliemann resupplied each boat with up to 200 tons of fuel. The crews got fresh food. Some boats exchanged personnel. The whole operation happened without interference from Allied forces, because Allied forces didn't know it was happening. It felt like the early Atlantic before the losses started. What none of them discussed, at least on record, was what would happen if the Charlotte Schliemann wasn't there next time. Here's the thing about the Indian Ocean campaign that the summer of 1943 obscured. Everything that made it work depended on a single aging tanker surviving in open water. 6 submarines could sink ships for months. They could not get home without help, and the help was visible. A ship that had to move to fix coordinates and stop there, waiting for submarines to find her. Every rendezvous was a potential ambush, if anyone on the Allied side ever learned where it was going to happen. The Charlotte Schliemann was an old Norwegian tanker, built in 1928, converted by the Kriegsmarine into a supply ship. She was the thing that made the long-range Indian Ocean campaign work. Without her, submarines couldn't get home. The round trip from Europe to the Indian Ocean and back was simply too far on the fuel a Type 9D could carry. By late 1943, Allied codebreakers were reading German naval signals with enough regularity to follow the Charlotte Schliemann's movements in detail. They knew her schedule. They knew which submarines she was supposed to meet. They knew the rendezvous coordinates before the ships arrived at them. On January 27, 1944, the Charlotte Schliemann met U-178 and U-510 in the southwestern Indian Ocean to deliver fuel and provisions. According to the Hyperwar Ultra document, Allied intelligence had read the orders and tracked her route. A British destroyer and aircraft from Mauritius were already on their way to the area. On February 12th, the British destroyer Relentless found the Charlotte Schliemann. Her crew scuttled her to prevent capture. The only German refueling ship in the Indian Ocean was gone. 5 submarines that had been counting on her, U-532, U-188, U-168, and UIT-24 among them, suddenly had nowhere to refuel for the homeward voyage. The signal from U-boat headquarters arrived. The Charlotte Schliemann was lost. There was one alternative. A second German tanker, the Break, the only other supply ship still operating in the region, immediately redirected to the waiting submarines with new rendezvous coordinates. Allied codebreakers were reading those signals too. On March 13th, 1944, exactly 29 days after the Charlotte Schliemann, aircraft from the escort carrier Battler, acting on Allied intelligence, found the Break and forced her crew to scuttle. Both refueling ships were gone in less than 5 weeks. The escape routes from the Indian Ocean had closed. What made this so effective as a strategy was its precision. Sinking the 2 tankers didn't require finding every submarine. It required finding 2 ships. The submarines were spread across an enormous ocean, difficult to track individually, but every one of them eventually needed fuel to go home. Destroying the fuel supply was simpler than hunting dozens of boats across millions of square miles of open water. The Allies had essentially found the single point of failure in the entire German Indian Ocean campaign and exploited it directly. The submarines waiting for the Break didn't know she was already compromised when they received the new rendezvous coordinates. They converged on the position in good faith, following standard procedure, doing exactly what they'd been told. And the Allied forces were already there waiting for them. Or rather, waiting for the tanker they knew was coming, because they'd read the orders in England before the tanker had even left port. The boats approaching the rendezvous point had no warning. They received the news about the Break the same way they'd received the news about the Charlotte Schliemann, as a radio signal announcing a catastrophe that had already happened. Picture being aboard UIT-24. You're not a regular German submarine. You're a converted Italian cargo boat taken over by the Germans after Italy's armistice, crewed by German and Italian volunteers. You left Penang in February 1944, loaded with quinine from Singapore, bound for Europe. The voyage requires at least 1 full refueling stop. Without it, your tanks run dry somewhere in the South Atlantic. You've been circling a set of coordinates in the Indian Ocean for days, waiting for the Charlotte Schliemann. According to the USNI Naval History account of UIT-24's voyage, by February 26th, the worry aboard was acute. The radio calls went unanswered. Then the response came from U-boat headquarters. She was gone. You're directed to the Break instead. New coordinates transmitted. Then the second message arrives. The Break is also gone. With fuel now critically low, the crew of UIT-24 understood the situation. No tanker, no nearby base. Penang was months behind them. Europe was months ahead. New orders came directing the boat southwest toward the Cape of Good Hope. But the battery situation deteriorated further during the attempt. UIT-24 ultimately had to abandon the homeward voyage entirely and return to Penang, and then went further east to Japan for repairs. She never made it back to Europe. The quinine cargo Germany needed so badly stayed in Asia. That was the boat that survived by retreating. Not everyone had that option. U-177, under Heinz Buchholz, was making for home in February 1944, when Royal Air Force aircraft found her west of Ascension Island. She went down with 50 men. 10 survived. Buchholz didn't. He'd spent months in the Indian Ocean surviving everything the Allies sent at him there, and a patrol bomber found him on the transit home. His crew had reached within striking distance of Europe after months at sea. The aircraft found them on the surface in daylight. That was all it took. The men in these boats had done everything right. They'd made the outward voyage. They'd found ships and sunk them. They were following orders home. What killed them wasn't a mistake on their part. It was a piece of paper decoded in England that told Allied forces exactly where to look. Think about what that means in practice. You're somewhere in the South Atlantic, 2 months from Europe, trying to find a tanker that isn't there anymore. You don't know why it isn't there. The radio traffic gives you a position, then tells you the position is no longer valid, then tells you to try another position. You're running low on fuel. You can't go faster without using more fuel. You can't surface in daylight without risking aircraft. You can't stay submerged without draining the batteries. Every option costs something you don't have enough of. And you don't know that the reason both tankers are gone is because someone in England read the orders before you did. The men aboard U-177 had done the voyage out, done the patrol, and were heading home when Royal Air Force aircraft found them west of Ascension Island in February 1944. Buchholz brought the boat down as fast as he could. The depth charges fell. Whether he survived long enough to understand what was happening is unknowable. 10 men escaped from the water. The other 50 didn't. 10 survivors out of 60. That's what coming home from the Indian Ocean sometimes looked like, even when you were almost there. Think about the arithmetic of the Monsun-Gruppe, the name given to the Indian Ocean submarine force. According to the USNI Proceedings account from August 1961, Admiral Dönitz ultimately committed 42 submarines to the Indian Ocean and Far East, including the converted Italian boats. He lost 12 to enemy action. 23 made the round trip successfully. The rest were dead ends one way or another, stuck in Japanese ports, lost on the return voyage, or never reaching the theatre at all. The boats that did operate effectively claimed 151 Allied ships sunk during the entire Indian Ocean campaign. That sounds significant until you consider how quickly the productive phase ended once the supply infrastructure collapsed in early 1944. Robert Bartels commanded U-197 and was among the most active of the summer 1943 group. On August 20th, 1943, Royal Air Force Catalina aircraft found his boat on the surface about 400 kilometers south-southwest of Madagascar. 2 planes attacked. The second attack sent U-197 down. All 67 crew members were killed. Bartels had been 32 years old. The families of those 67 men received official telegrams. Standard language. Missing on patrol, later killed in action. There was no description of what had happened. No way for the families to know that 2 aircraft found the boat on the surface in the remote southern Indian Ocean, and that she sank quickly enough that no one escaped. Werner Hartmann came home from his first Indian Ocean patrol with 7 ships sunk and over 200 days at sea behind him. He handed U-198 to a new commander in early 1944. Burkhard Heusinger von Waldeck took the boat out on the Second Indian Ocean Patrol in April 1944. On August 12, 1944, north of Madagascar near the Seychelles, the British frigate Findhorn and the Indian sloop Godavari found U-198 and hit her with depth charges. No survivors. Every man aboard went down. Heusinger von Waldeck had been 28 years old. Hartmann himself survived the war. He lived until 1963. He retired from the post-war German Navy as a captain. He'd spent over 200 days in the Indian Ocean and reached Bordeaux with the boat intact on the first patrol. The men who served after him in the same boat, on the same ocean, were not as fortunate as their former captain. That's the pattern that runs through the whole campaign. The commanders who went first and came back, the commanders who came after and didn't. The Indian Ocean wasn't uniformly dangerous. It was dangerous in stages, and the stage that killed most men was the one that started when the codebreakers in England began reading the tanker schedules in real time. Before February 1944, the campaign had produced results and cost relatively few boats. After February 1944, it became a series of individual tragedies played out across a vast ocean with no rescue and no explanation available to the families waiting at home. Alfred Ike took over U-510 in May 1943 and sailed her to the Indian Ocean on a patrol that lasted 155 days before reaching Penang in April 1944. The outward voyage had been productive. In late March 1944, operating in the Arabian Sea and the Laccadive Sea, Ike sank 5 ships. According to the USNI proceedings account, he reached Penang with a solid patrol result, exactly what the Monsoon Grouper mission was supposed to produce. Ike eventually left for Europe in January 1945, U-510 loaded with cargo Germany needed: tin, rubber, tungsten, quinine. He made it. The boat reached Saint-Nazaire in France on April 23, 1945, after 103 days at sea. Ike was one of the very few Monsoon Grouper commanders who completed the full circuit and came home. The contrast with what happened to U-196 is hard to reconcile. U-196 had been Eitel Friedrich Kentrat's boat since September 1942. His second patrol in the Indian Ocean, which began in March 1943, became the longest single combat patrol of the entire Second World War. 225 days at sea. Kentrat reached Penang on October 23, 1943, after 7.5 months at sea. He'd crossed 2 oceans, operated in the waters around Madagascar and East Africa, and brought the boat back intact. The record stood for the rest of the war and has never been broken. Kentrat handed U-196 to a new commander in September 1944, Werner Striegler, who had previously survived the sinking of the Italian-built UIT-23 in the Straits of Malacca, took command of U-196 in October 1944. Striegler had already been through 1 submarine loss. Now he was given a second boat. U-196 left Batavia on November 29, 1944, on a brief assignment to refuel a sister boat in the Indian Ocean. On November 30th, the submarine sent what would be its last routine radio message. Then, nothing. Efforts to contact U-196 through December failed to produce a response. She was listed as missing near the Sunda Straits south of Java, effective December 1st. Her wreck has never been found. The cause of her loss remains unknown. Possibly a mine, possibly an Allied submarine, possibly a diving accident. 65 men disappeared. Lawrence Patterson, writing in Hitler's Grey Wolves, U-boats in the Indian Ocean, noted that Allied submarines in the area had made no claims, and that the Sunda Strait wasn't mined until weeks later by a Dutch submarine. German U-boat headquarters eventually concluded the boat had been ambushed by an enemy submarine, but the Allies were equally puzzled. U-196 and her crew had simply vanished. No wreckage, no survivors, no explanation. There is one unexplained clue. A crew member named Dr. Heinz Harker is buried in a German military cemetery in Bogor, on the slopes of Mount Pangrango in Java, with U-196 carved into his gravestone. How he came to be buried on land, while the rest of the crew apparently went down with the boat, is unexplained in any record that has survived. It suggests someone made it ashore. Beyond that, nothing is known. Striegler had already survived the loss of 1 submarine before taking command of U-196. He'd been aboard UIT-23 when a British submarine torpedoed her in the Straits of Malacca in February 1944. He was one of 14 survivors out of 40. He was given U-196 as a new command. By December 1st, 1944, he was gone too. The second submarine, the same ocean, no survivors this time. The strategic collapse of the Indian Ocean campaign had one central cause. It wasn't Allied anti-submarine aircraft, though those helped. It wasn't improved sonar on British frigates, though that mattered in individual encounters. It was the fact that Allied intelligence could read the German Navy's encoded signals. The German naval Enigma cipher had been partially compromised since 1941, and more completely penetrated from 1943 onward. The Hyperwar Ultra document on U-boat operations notes explicitly that both the Charlotte Schliemanns and the Brakes tanker expeditions were followed, currently, by Allied intelligence, meaning in real time as the signals were transmitted, and that this was the first time the Atlantic Intelligence Section had achieved this level of current coverage of Indian Ocean operations. A surface tanker at a fixed position in open ocean, with submarines converging from multiple directions, was the most vulnerable target this intelligence could produce. The rendezvous coordinates were decoded before the ships arrived at them. Allied warships and aircraft weren't discovering these ships by brilliant navigation or lucky sighting. They were sent directly to them. After February and March of 1944, U-boat headquarters made attempts to reorganize the supply problem. Submarines sometimes refueled from one another in improvised ocean transfers. A few boats stayed at Penang and operated locally. The cargo runs between Japan and Europe continued fitfully. But the fluid, independent operations that had made summer 1943 so productive were finished. By 1945, the surviving boats in the Far East were mostly immobile at Penang, Singapore, or Batavia, waiting for fuel or repairs that weren't coming, while the Japanese ally they'd been operating alongside managed its own collapse. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Dönitz ordered the Far Eastern boats to surrender to the nearest Allied or Japanese forces. Some did. Several whose commanders refused scuttled their own boats in harbour. The campaign simply dissolved. 42 submarines committed. 12 lost to enemy action. The rest tangled in a supply crisis that code breaking had manufactured in the space of 30 days. The strange coda to the entire campaign is what happened to the boats that made it to Japan. By the summer of 1944, U-510, U-532, U-183, and UIT-24 and UIT-25 had all reached Kobe for repairs. They waited there while Germany's strategic situation deteriorated. Some of them eventually left for Europe with cargo. Most didn't make it. The attempt to return across two oceans under wartime conditions without reliable tanker support became a journey that few boats completed. Alfred Ike completed it in U-510. He arrived in France in April 1945. He was one of the last. The war ended 3 weeks later. What the Indian Ocean had promised in the summer of 1943, a theatre where submarines could still work, still come home, still matter, had turned into something else entirely. A place where men went, and the ocean kept them. U-198 is still down there, somewhere north of Madagascar, near the Seychelles, about 3,000 meters below the surface. No one has found it. The depth makes the search nearly impossible. At that pressure, in that cold, in that dark metal lasts for centuries without changing much. Everything aboard is still there. The torpedo room, the engine space, the narrow bunks where men slept in shifts, personal photographs in lockers, the patrol log with its last entries, the convoy attacks off Mozambique on August 6th and 7th, the position reports, the dates of ships that no longer exist. Burkhard Heusinger von Waldeck, who was 28 years old when the Findhorn's depth charges hit on August 12th, is still aboard. So are the men who served under him on the 2nd Indian Ocean Patrol. They've been there since 1944. They'll be there long after the last person who remembers the Monson-Gruppe is gone. Werner Hartmann, who commanded U-198 on the first patrol and handed it over before the second, came home. He lived until 1963. He went on to other commands, received more decorations, retired from the post-war German Navy as a captain. He spent over 200 days in the Indian Ocean and reached Bordeaux with the boat intact. His successor made the same voyage and didn't come back. That's not a strategic failure, or a tactical error, or a code-breaking story at that scale. It's just two men, the same boat, the same ocean. One came home. One is 3,000 meters down. 3,000 meters down, north of Madagascar. The boat that spent 2 patrols in the ocean where German commanders once believed there was nothing to fear.